Curriculum Vitae of Arthur Schopenhauer, Doctor of Philosophy. You may drive nature out with a pitchfork, yet she will always hurry back. As I now set about narrating the course of my life, many more things occur to me to relate than I think is usually the case for writers of such life stories. This must be traced back to the fact that the condition of life I enjoy and the studies I pursue were not, as for most people, thrown at me by chance, or pointed out by the prudence of others, but my own choice alone gave them to me. The path, however, to reach where I am, was not only not smooth and paved, but hindered, blocked, and even unknown to me from the beginning. Born in Gdansk on the 22nd day of February in the year 1788, my father was Heinrich Florus, my mother Johanna Henrika Trojanera, who is still alive and well known even through several published writings. However, it was nearly the case that I became English, for my mother, with childbirth already imminent, was brought back to Gdansk from England. My father, that excellent man, was a rather wealthy merchant, even a counselor of the Polish king, although he never allowed himself to be called so. He was a most keen man, but also most upright, most honorable, and of the most incorruptible fidelity, endowed moreover with remarkable perspicacity in business matters. How much I owe to this man I can scarcely express in words. For although the path he had intended to lead me along, however excellent it seemed to him, was not suited to my disposition, nevertheless the fact that I was imbued early on with good arts and then freedom, leisure, and all the resources for pursuing those studies for which I was uniquely born, and for cultivating my mind with learning, were readily available to me, and finally, that even later, in more mature years, those advantages were available to me without my own effort, advantages which very few of my condition and character have enjoyed, namely the freest leisure and a perfect absence of all cares, through which it was permitted for me to devote myself for many subsequent years solely to studies far removed from gain and to more abstract investigations and meditations, and lastly to commit to writing, with nothing distracting or disturbing me, what I had investigated and conceived. I owe all this uniquely to that man. For no Caesar made this leisure for us. Therefore, I shall always remember with the most grateful mind as long as I live, the truly inexpressible merits and kindnesses of that excellent father towards me, and I shall hold his memory most sacred. When in the year 1793 the King of Prussia, the most august father of the now happily reigning monarch, brought the city of Gdansk under his power, my father, a most ardent lover of both freedom and his country, could not bear to witness the fall of the ancient republic. Therefore, a few hours before the Prussian army occupied the city, he departed with his wife and son, and having spent the night in his villa, on the following day by a hurried journey, he proceeded to Hamburg. But he redeemed himself and his family alone from the disaster of the city only at great expense to himself, for not only is a change of location a most damaging thing for a merchant, and likewise the sale of goods at an unfortunate moment in time detrimental, but moreover, 1/10 part of all his fortunes had to be paid into the treasury. But when he had done this, he was declared free and released from all ties with the city. In this way indeed, I, still at a very tender age, I was in my 5th year, was made an exile from my homeland. Nor did I ever afterwards acquire a new homeland. For although my father had his residence in Hamburg from that time until the end of his life, and carried on business there, he never wished to be enrolled in the number of citizens. On the contrary, using the law pertaining to foreigners there, he was always considered a stranger. But concerning me, his only son and heir at that time, my only sister was born 10 years after me, he had decided this, that I should become a distinguished merchant, and also a most refined and polished man. To this end, he considered it necessary above all that I should thoroughly master the Franco-Gallic language. Therefore, in the year 1798, he had undertaken a journey to France and England for pleasure, and he took me with him, being in my 10th year and until then engaged in the usual studies in a private school. Having seen Paris, he led me to Le Havre, Havre de Grace, where he left me with a certain merchant, connected to him by friendship, so that, if possible, I might become completely Franco-Gallic. That merchant, a good, fair, gentle man, regarded me completely as another son, and together with his own son, of the same age as me, he took care of my education. Therefore, we were instructed by private tutors who came to us in all good and age-appropriate arts, so that indeed, besides the French language, I learned many other useful things there, and some rudiments of the Latin language were also taught, but this was done only for show and entirely for the purpose of not being completely bewildered if a Latin word should ever come my way. Therefore, in that most pleasant town, situated at the mouth of the Seine and overlooking the sea, I spent by far the most enjoyable part of my childhood. Having stayed there for more than 2 years, I was then conveyed alone by ship to Hamburg, when I had not yet completed my 12th year. The good father rejoiced in a wonderful way when he heard me chattering as if I were Franco-Gallic. But I had so unlearned my native tongue that I understood what was said to me only with the greatest difficulty. Now, however, I attended a private school in Hamburg, where the sons of many nobles and wealthy Hamburgers were educated. The headmaster of that school was Kayungius, a doctor of philosophy, also the author of a certain booklet on pedagogy. Therefore, using the instruction of this excellent man and others teaching there, I diligently learned whatever is considered to benefit a natural talent and to befit a freeborn man. But only 1 hour a week was devoted to the Latin language, and even this was done for show and superficially. I used that instruction for almost 4 years. But long before the end of this time, a great inclination seized me to devote my efforts to literature, and I especially urged my father to indulge me in this matter and not to want to make me a merchant. But he was most strongly averse to this plan and would not allow himself to be persuaded, looking, in his judgment, solely to my benefit. However, since I, deterred or wearied by no refusals, always assailed his ears with the same entreaties, and even my teacher testified that I had other and greater gifts of intellect than those that would be useful to a merchant. Finally, the firmest mind of my father was so far broken, certainly shaken, that he now, although unwillingly, agreed, and began to speak of handing me over to be educated at the gymnasium. Since my well-being was especially close to this excellent father's heart, but at the same time in his mind the association of ideas had bound the notion of literature to the notion of poverty with the firmest knot. He considered it his primary concern to take timely precautions against this impending danger. Therefore, he began to consider making me a canon of Hamburg, and entered into negotiations regarding the conditions of this matter. However, since they did not immediately agree on the price to be paid for this, a considerable sum indeed, this caused a delay in the whole plan concerning the change in my studies. But during this delay, my father resumed hope of bringing it about that I would abandon my intention. However, the utmost respect for the innate freedom of each individual prevented him from achieving this by force. But he did not hesitate to try to tempt me. He knew that I was most eager for things to see, and also that I had long been held by a most vehement desire to revisit Le Havre and the most pleasant friends living there. Therefore, he declared to me that in the following spring he would undertake a long journey through a large part of Europe for pleasure, together with his wife, and that I too could be a participant in this most beautiful journey, in which I would also have the opportunity to revisit Le Havre, if only I would promise him that afterwards I would devote my efforts to nothing but trade. But if I persisted in my intention to study literature, I would have to remain in Hamburg to learn the Latin language. The choice was now mine. My youthful spirit did not resist these solicitations. Having deliberated, I promised what he had asked. And so, in the spring of the year 1803, when I was entering my 16th year, I set out from Hamburg together with my parents. Batavia was seen first, and from Gaul we crossed over into England. After we had stayed in London for a year and a half, my parents continued their journey into the interior of England and Scotland, but I was left with a certain clergyman living near London, so that I might thoroughly learn the English language, which I did well, having spent 3 months there. Afterwards, my parents having returned to London, I joined them again and spent another year and a half there. Then we crossed over again into Batavia, whence, through Belgium, we betook ourselves to Paris, where we stayed for the greater part of the winter. At that time, indeed, I also revisited Le Havre. Then we went to see Bordeaux, Montpellier, Nîmes, Marseille, Toulon, and the Hires Islands. Then, having also seen Lyon, we entered Switzerland, and having traversed all of it, we went to Vienna, whence we traveled as far as Dresden, Berlin, and finally Gdansk. Having thus revisited my former homeland in the first days of the year 1805, after an absence of almost 2 years, we were made to return to Hamburg. It is indeed clear to me that, through that very long journey, 2 years of my youth, which are usually spent empty of other things and devoted to learning languages, passed by completely empty of this benefit. Yet, even if I doubt whether some fruit did not redound to me from that journey, fully compensating for that lost benefit, nay, even surpassing it. For in those years of early adolescence, in which the human mind is then most open to all kinds of impressions, and then most eager and curious to perceive and understand things, my mind was not, as usually happens, filled with words and stories about things of which it could have no true subsequent knowledge, nor was the first keenness of my mind blunted and wearied in that way, but instead of these, my mind and intellect were nourished by the sight of things, and were truly educated, and therefore it learned what and what kind of things they were before it received traditions about their changes and their relationships with each other. In short, I indeed rejoice that, having progressed in that way, I became accustomed early on not to rest in mere words, but to far prefer the vision and inspection of things and the knowledge that is generated by intuition to sounding words. by which means indeed it was ensured for me that words could never afterwards be for me instead of things. Therefore, I now in no way regret that journey. But a much more ruinous and truly deplorable disaster then awaited me. For having returned to Hamburg, I had to abide by my promises and without hesitation devote myself to the business of trade. Therefore, I was handed over for training to a very famous merchant, who was also a senator of the Republic. But in truth, no worse mercantile scribe was ever found than me. With my whole heart I loathed that business, and always intent on other things I neglected my duties, nor did I study anything else daily except how I might gain some time which I could spend at home reading books, or at least with which I could nourish my mind with thoughts and imaginations. Indeed, even in the very room destined for mercantile writing, I always kept hidden books with which I would delight myself as soon as I was unwatched. And when that very famous metaposcopist and master of craniology, a Gaul, gave lectures in Hamburg, I, so that I could diligently attend them, daily frustrated my merchant by tricks and deceptions during those hours. Besides these virtues of mine, a deep sadness of mind, born partly from the fact that in place of the continuous delights of the mind to which the long journey had accustomed me, a hateful occupation and the worst servitude had now succeeded, and partly from the fact that I understood more and more that I had followed a ruined life, which error, however, I completely despaired of still being able to correct, made me rebellious and troublesome to others. To these evils of mine soon came an even more deadly misfortune. My excellent and dearest father was suddenly snatched away by a chance, bloody kind of death. From this most sorrowful grief, my sadness, already so great, increased to such an extent that it was little short of true melancholy. Although I was now, as it were, my own master, nor did my mother hinder me in any way, nevertheless I continued to perform my duty with the merchant, partly because excessive sadness had broken the strength of my spirit, partly because I considered it a matter of conscience to rescind his decrees immediately after my father's death, and finally because I already considered myself to be of an age too advanced to still be able to learn the ancient languages. For I little suspected that fortune was then dealing with me no differently than she once did with Tarquin and the Sibyl. I spent almost 2 years with that merchant, which I completely lost without any benefit. Finally, towards the end of this time, when I, tormented by an intolerable sickness of mind, poured out lamentable complaints in letters written to my mother, who was now living in Weimar, about the lost fruit of my whole life, about the irreparable damage to my strength and youth, uselessly spent in vain business, and finally about my already more advanced age, too late to still be able to enter upon a new path, having abandoned the former, it happened that the very famous Furnovius, a man of great talent indeed, and at that time very intimate with my mother, looked into those letters and moved by them, wrote to me, although otherwise unknown to him, in which he made it clear to me that the loss of time I had made up to this point was still reparable, and he proved this by proposing the examples of himself and others, and those the greatest men in literature, who had approached the study of letters quite late, and finally he became an authority for me so that, having abandoned all other things, I should devote myself to the study of the ancient languages. Having read this letter, I burst into a flood of tears and immediately, although otherwise very slow to make any choices, my mind was made up. Therefore, having sent a message to the merchant, I immediately set out for Weimar, which was indeed at the beginning of the year 1807, when I had just completed my 18th year. Thence, without delay at Furnovius's urging, I betook myself to Gotha, and became a student at the very famous and flourishing gymnasium there. However, I could attend no schools except those held in the vernacular, on account of my complete ignorance of the ancient languages. But the very famous Doring, the director of the gymnasium, had 2 very private lessons with me daily, in which he taught me the rudiments of the Latin language, for such was my ignorance of this language that even the declensions of words and nouns had to be learned by me. Soon, however, it happened through my incredible progress that Doring prophesied and foretold the best, nay even the most glorious things for my future. Wherefore indeed, having gradually emerged from that sadness and despair, I turned my mind to a happier hope, and with the utmost eagerness and exertion of my powers, I labored towards the end I had set for myself. But behold a new disaster. I had not yet learned to abstain from dangerous witticisms, which thing ruined me there. A certain Schultz, a professor of that gymnasium whom I do not even remember ever seeing, had thrown out some rather bitter remarks in the public newspapers against a select class of the gymnasium, to which I also, namely for the German language classes, was enrolled. Therefore, I indeed attacked his publicly stated remarks with some jokes during dinner. But this rashness, having been reported to him, had the effect that Doring renounced his very private lessons with me, at the same time however affirming that he had perceived singular delight in teaching me, but that he had to keep the faith he had pledged. He also invited me to remain in the gymnasium, making use of someone else's very private lessons. But I did not wish to do this. Therefore, having left the gymnasium of Gotha for the space of a semester, I betook myself to Weimar, where the very famous Passo, already a professor at the University of Wrocław, imparted very private lessons to me on the Latin, and soon also on the Greek language. Then, however, he reserved for himself only the Greek lessons to be held with me, but the Latin language was taught to me in very private lessons by the celebrated Lenz, the director of the Gymnasium of Weimar, a man whom scarcely anyone can surpass in speaking Latin. Therefore, I owe the greatest thanks to both of these men, who deserved very well of me. But I, driven by a certain thirst for learning, with tireless diligence and the utmost zeal and effort, earnestly, nay anxiously, labored to repair the losses of the past and to compensate for the lost fruit of so many years with late diligence. By no means sparing of money to procure any aids for myself, but wonderfully frugal of leisure, so diligent that daily, through all the hours of the day until midnight, I lay upon books and papers, just as one who toiled for his daily bread, barely to be obtained. Nor did I live in my mother's house, but in the same house as Passo, so that I always had my teacher at hand. The far greater part of my studies concerned languages. Moreover, with the help of books alone, I also cultivated mathematics and history, with the elements of which I had already been imbued beforehand. Occupied with these studies, I spent 2 years in Weimar, after the completion of which my teachers affirmed that I was now ready for the university, and indeed I can profess, although it may seem strange to some, that at that time all the losses from my former negligence had been fully repaired within 2.5 years. I later took the most joyful proof of this from the fact that, when I was at the university, whenever the opportunity arose, I often found that in my knowledge of the ancient languages I was not only equal to other students of literature, but far surpassed the great majority, even sometimes those who were devoted to philology. Which matter, at least in part, must be traced back to the fact that I, for the most part self-taught, had read many more of the ancient writers than those who had been educated in the gymnasium, where of course everyone progresses together in a group and step by step. Moreover, I religiously continued that assiduous reading of Greek and Latin writers afterwards as well, through all the years I spent at the university, dedicating 2 hours daily to that pursuit. From which this especially advantageous result arose for me. First, I was initiated more and more into antiquity, and I understood its character and recognized its excellence, which indeed then only fully revealed itself to me when, in this now declining year, it happened that I could behold in person, in Italy, the most sacred and beautiful monuments of antiquity, and even perceive the breadth of its character from the smallest relics of that more august age. Then, as I had begun to say, by that continuous reading of the ancient writers, especially the Greek philosophers, even my German composition or style, was greatly aided, amended and corrected. Finally, that constant reading prevented that knowledge of the ancient languages so quickly acquired by me, from also quickly slipping away from me. Nay, it struck such deep roots in my mind that it has not become obsolete even now, after so many and varied studies have intervened. Even recently the prolonged use of the Italian language, than which nothing can be more harmful to Latin speech and writing, has not harmed me, in proof of which I affirm with all assurance that I now write all these things without the help of any mortal, nor indeed shall I subject them to the eyes of another before they are sent to Berlin, since, although I know that I can err even in speaking, this, if it should happen, would have to be ascribed solely to human frailty and carelessness, but not to my ignorance. But let pardon be given for this whole recollection to a man who, when he was 18 years old, learned to decline the word mensa. For otherwise these things would certainly be boastful, and indeed a display about a small matter. In the year 1819, when I had reached my legal majority, my mother handed over to me my inheritance, i.e., the third part of the goods left by my father, as much as still remained, which money indeed sufficed so that I could always live securely by making loans. Then therefore I sought Göttingen, where I enrolled in medicine. But after I had acquired a slight knowledge of myself and at the same time of philosophy, I changed my mind, and in the second semester of my studies, having abandoned medicine, I now devoted myself solely to philosophy. Nor had the study of medicine turned out to be a waste of time for me, since I had not yet attended any lectures except those which are also useful, nay necessary, for a cultivator of philosophy. Therefore, during the 2 years which I spent in Göttingen, I applied myself to the study of literature with the same assiduity to which I was already accustomed, from which the company of my fellow students could by no means distract or separate me, because my more mature age, richer experience, and very different character always set me apart and surrounded me with solitude, which made it so that, although I diligently attended lectures, Much time still remained for reading books, which leisure was indeed especially devoted to Plato and Kant. Therefore, during that 2-year period, I attended the lectures of G. E. Schulz on logic, metaphysics, and psychology. I listened to Thibaut teaching pure mathematics, to Heron teaching both ancient and more recent history, then also about the Crusades and also ethnography. I sat in on Luther's lectures on the history of the German Empire. From Blumenbach I received instruction in natural history, mineralogy, physiology, and comparative anatomy, in the anatomy of the human body from Hempel, in chemistry from Strohmeyer, in physics and physical astronomy from Tobias Meyer, in botany from Schrader. From the instruction of these most distinguished men, I gratefully acknowledge that I received the greatest benefit. Now in the autumn of the year 1821, I migrated to Berlin. There also, having been enrolled in the number of academic citizens, I earnestly strove, to the best of my ability, to cultivate my mind and spirit more fully by the instruction of the most famous men with whom that literary university abounded. Therefore I listened to Wolff, then elucidating Greek and Latin poets, then Greek antiquities, then teaching the history of Greek literature. I gratefully acknowledge Schleiermacher for the history of philosophy. I listened with the greatest pleasure of mind to Ehrman publicly discussing magnetism and electricity. I attended all of Lichtenstein's various recitations on zoology for a year and a half. From Klaproth I again received experimental chemistry, likewise physics from Fischer, astronomy from Bode, geognosy from Weiss, general physiology from Horkel, and the anatomy of the human brain from Rosenthal. I shall always remember with a grateful mind the distinguished merits of all these most celebrated men towards me. I also listened most diligently to Fichte, teaching his philosophy, so that I might afterwards be able to form a more just judgment about it. And also sometimes in that conversation which he had with his listeners, I disputed with him at length, which debate, those who were present perhaps still remember. I would also have stayed in Berlin for 2 years, had not the tumults of war driven me away in the last semester of this time, namely in the spring of the year 1823, which matter was all the more deplorable for me because I was then especially girding myself to duly seek the highest honors in philosophy from the most distinguished order of philosophers of the University of Berlin, for which purpose indeed, after the very famous and always most benevolent Lichtenstein had informed me what the required conditions and specimens for that matter were, I had begun to write a dissertation, on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, and in German indeed, according to the institution of the most distinguished order. But when the city of Berlin itself was feared because of the uncertain outcome of the battle fought at Lutzen, and all who were in any way permitted took to flight, the majority to Frankfurt or Wrocław. But I, thinking it best to go to meet the enemy, directed my journey to Dresden, to which, through various misfortunes and dangers, I finally arrived on the 12th day. It was already then in my mind to remain there, but when I foresaw in my mind the future dangers for this city, I proceeded as far as Weimar. There indeed my mother's house was to be used as a lodging, where certain domestic matters so vehemently displeased me that, seeking another refuge I withdrew to Rudolstadt, where in a public lodging, since in those tumultuous times it seemed a most suitable and completely proper dwelling for a man lacking any homeland, I spent the rest of the year. Moreover, in those times, the greatest sickness and sadness had again invaded my mind, arising especially from the fact that I saw my life had fallen upon times of such a kind that they plainly required virtues other than those whose seeds I felt were within me. But in my retreat at Rudolstadt indeed I was held by the inexpressible pleasantness of those regions. Most alien by nature to military affairs, I rejoiced that in that valley, enclosed on all sides by forests, throughout all that warlike summer, I did not see even one soldier, nor hear any drums. Finally, in the deepest solitude, distracted or called away by nothing, I devoted myself without interruption to the most abstruse studies and meditations. The library of Weimar supplied books. There therefore I completed my dissertation, on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, always with the hope that the opportunity would again be given to me to return to Berlin, where I might aspire to the degree of doctor. But since this was less likely to happen, with the roads not opened either by the truces made or by the new war that followed them, and since the title of doctor was then especially useful to me, I approached the most distinguished order of philosophers of the University of Jena, then situated very near to me, sending that dissertation with a Latin letter, with prayers that it would elevate me to the highest honors in philosophy, which indeed it did out of its kindness. But with the approaching winter, which seemed to me very sad in that rustic and solitary refuge of mine, then also occupied by soldiers, I returned to Weimar, where I spent the whole winter. Now, however, as a solace for my so great afflictions, something happened to me which I count especially among the most joyful and fortunate events of my life. that immense glory of our century and the German nation, the supreme Goethe, whose name no times will silence, deigned to honor me with his friendship and intimacy. For up to this point I was known to him only by sight, nor was he accustomed to address me. But when he had perused my dissertation, he approached me of his own accord, and asked that I would be willing to work on his theory of colors, promising at the same time that he would assist me with any interpretations and all aids pertaining to that matter, so that, throughout that winter, that study could supply material for frequent conversations between us, whether I should support or oppose his decrees. A few days later he sent me his own apparatus and instruments for evoking the phenomena of colors. He himself also afterwards showed me more difficult experiments, greatly rejoicing that my mind, blinded by no preconceived opinions, recognized the truth of his theory, to which indeed even now assent and support are withheld by many, for reasons which it is not relevant to relate here. Since, throughout that whole winter, the Supreme Man frequently summoned me, our conversations were by no means confined to the investigations of colors, but we exchanged words on any philosophical matters, and often prolonged them for many hours, from which intimacy indeed I perceived immense and incredible benefit. But in the early spring of the year 1824, with all things peaceful, I betook myself to Dresden, intending to prosecute my studies further, especially to establish the system of philosophy which I was already then meditating. The greatest aids for this matter were provided for me especially by that excellent royal library, then the most praiseworthy Pinacotheca, also the collections of ancient statues, then of gems, then of plaster casts, and finally the most excellent apparatus of things pertaining to natural history. Therefore, in that most pleasant city I spent 4.5 years most peacefully, uniquely intent on many various literary studies, but especially occupied with the reading of all philosophers, as many as ever existed, namely those who brought forth their own meditations, not so much those who merely illustrated or rehashed the thoughts of others. Amidst these studies in the year 1825, I conceived a new theory of colors. For I understood, namely, that Goethe had discovered nothing other than the way in which those colors which we call physical exist and arise, rather than having given a general theory of colors beforehand, which indeed it was clear to me, ought to be not physical or chemical, but purely physiological. But concerning my theory of colors, which at that time, committed to writing, I sent to Goethe, I disputed with him throughout the year by letters sent back and forth, but the Supreme Man always refused to give his assent, although he never objected to me even one little argument to the contrary, but only because my theory, just as it contradicts Newton's in all things, so also it contradicts Goethe's in certain particulars. The intellect, as Bacon of Verulam says, is not a dry light, but receives an infusion from the will and affections. Therefore, I published that treatise on colors in the year 1826, nor did I hesitate to be the first public supporter of Goethe. For the rest, I certainly know that the theory explained there by me is true, and the only true one, and will also be recognized as such. How soon, I do not much labor, since I acquiesce in this, that neither the malice of silence nor the stubbornness of deniers has ever been able to uproot or overwhelm the truth. For to use the words of Livy, truth, they say, is too often toiled over, never extinguished. Finally, in the year 1828, I brought to completion my system of philosophy, to the elaboration of which I had devoted assiduous effort for 5 years. Then, however, after 11 years of continuous literary studies, I decided to refresh my mind with a journey. Therefore, I betook myself to Vienna, whence, having entered Italy, I saw Venice, then went to Bologna, then visited Florence, and finally arrived at Rome, where, having stayed for almost 4 months, I nourished my mind with the contemplation of the monuments of antiquity, and likewise the works of more recent art. I also visited Naples. Having admired Pompeii, Herculaneum, Pozzuoli, Baiae, and Cumae, I proceeded as far as Paestum, where, having enjoyed with my eyes the most ancient, and also most beautiful temples of the city of Poseidonia, unshaken by the succession of 25 centuries, considering with a certain holy awe that I was now setting foot on that pavement which perhaps had been trodden by the very soul of Plato. Afterwards I also spent almost a month in Florence, visited Venice again, then went to see Padua, Verona, Vicenza, and finally Milan. Lastly, I crossed over the highest mountain of St. Gothard into Switzerland. Having spent 11 months on that journey, in the month of August of this year, I was made to return to Dresden. Now, however, the desire to teach also occupied my mind, which up to this point had only burned with the desire to learn. So that I might be allowed to satisfy this, I approached with prayers the most distinguished order of philosophers of the University of Berlin,